For decades, the main battle tank has been seen as the ultimate weapon of armored warfare. Heavily armed, heavily armored, and designed to dominate the battlefield. And yet, not every army in the world relies solely on MBTs. In fact, there's another class of armored vehicle that has proven its worth time and again: the tank destroyer. Now, I know this sounds a little ridiculous, but bear with me. It's a lot more practical than you may think. Once a staple of World War II, tank destroyers have largely disappeared from modern military doctrines. You don't see them used very often anymore, and that's because it's been replaced, as I said, by the MBT, the main battle tank. But why? More importantly, could and should tank destroyers make a comeback in modern militaries? And we're also going to be looking at why some countries, like Italy with the Centauro, continue to invest in tank destroyers. Are they truly outdated relics, or are they an overlooked potential in modern conflict? To understand whether tank destroyers have a future, we first need to understand their past. During World War II, tank destroyers were built for a singular purpose: to hunt and destroy enemy tanks. They came in different forms. Most were turretless, like the German Jagdpanther, prioritizing heavy armor and powerful guns, but sacrificing mobility. Others, like the American M10 Wolverine, had a fully traversable turret and relied on speed and long-range firepower instead of armor. The one thing that tank destroyers rarely, if ever, sacrificed, though, was that firepower. They relied on their guns, because they're tank destroyers. Their sole purpose is to destroy enemy vehicles. So it doesn't matter if the tank destroyer has no armor, like a Nazor, or if it has too much armor, like the Jagdtiger. It's going to have a good gun. They were effective, but after the war, the main battle tank, or MBT, emerged as the dominant force in armored warfare. By the Cold War, most militaries phased out a dedicated tank destroyer in their military in favor of multi-role main battle tanks. The logic was simple. Why have a vehicle dedicated only to killing tanks, when you could have a tank that could do everything? Fight tanks, support infantry, withstand more damage, yada yada yada, so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean the tank destroyer concept disappeared completely. In fact, some nations, like Italy, China, and even the United States of America, the good old USA, have continued to experiment with modern versions of tank destroyers, proving they might still have a role in the 21st century. One of the most successful modern tank destroyers is the Italian Centauro. And yes, Italy actually makes tank destroyers, and it's not bad. Unlike its World War II predecessors, the Centauro is a wheeled tank destroyer, not a tracked one. It's an 8x8 vehicle, which means it has 4 wheels on each side, very highly mobile. It can get up to 100 kilometers or more per hour on the road, which is pretty dang quick. First introduced in the 1980s, the B-1 Centauro was designed as a fast, mobile anti-tank platform. Instead of the slower, more heavily armored approach of traditional tanks, it focused on speed, firepower, and strategic mobility. And that makes sense because in the last video I made, we talked about the Ferdinand and why the Ferdinand tank destroyer was not built for Italian fighting, and why the Italians like to build lighter, faster vehicles, because the Italian terrain is better suited to vehicles like the Centauro. The Centauro is armed, well, the Centauro B-1 was armed with the 105mm cannon, the same caliber used on many NATO tanks at the time, like the Leopard 1 and certain models of the Centurion, allowing it to engage armor exceedingly effectively. Later, the Centauro II upgraded this to a 120mm smoothbore gun, putting it on par with modern MBTs like the Leopard 2 and the Abrams. So, why did Italy choose a tank destroyer instead of relying just on tanks? The answer lies, like I said, in Italy's geography and in their military strategy. Unlike countries like Russia or Germany, Italy doesn't need a large fleet of heavy tanks for deep land offensives. Instead, it needed something fast, mobile, and able to operate on roads in urban environments. This is where wheeled tank destroyers shine. Unlike tracked tanks, they can be deployed faster, they require less maintenance, and move more quickly on roads without needing transport trucks. That's why the Centauro was successfully adopted not just by Italy, but also by Spain, Jordan, and Oman, nations that needed mobility and firepower without the logistical burden of MBTs. And Italy is not the only country that has experimented with tank destroyers in modern warfare. Let's take a look at Japan's Type 16 Mobile Combat Vehicle, or MCV, used by the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force, basically the Japanese Army. Like the Centauro, it's a wheeled tank destroyer designed to provide fast-moving anti-armor support. It also has a 105mm gun and is meant to counter enemy tanks in Japan's island-based defense strategy. You see, Japan, as I just now said, is an island nation. And so, transporting 40, 50, 60, 70-ton tanks between islands is not an ideal strategy because it's expensive, it requires special materials and equipment, it's not easy to transport by air, so on and so forth. But a lighter, much more mobile, wheeled tank destroyer is far more flexible. In fact, the Japanese tank destroyer is designed to be potentially air transported, which means you could take it to an airplane or a Chinook or something, and you could fly it to where it needs to go, making it far more flexible and versatile than the traditional tank. Then we have China's ST-1, another wheeled tank destroyer that has been marketed to multiple countries. It's again built for rapid deployment, giving armored support to forces in regions where heavy MBTs would struggle to operate. And even the United States experiments with the concept, or at least they did. They had M1128 mobile gun system based on the Striker, and it was meant to provide a fast-moving, lightly armored tank-killing vehicle. However, it was eventually retired due to protection issues and mechanical failures, a key reason why many militaries hesitate to embrace modern tank destroyers. If tank destroyers still have potential then, why aren't they more common? There are several reasons. First of all, MBTs can do the job of a tank destroyer. Modern MBTs have become much faster, much more mobile, much more versatile. They have much more dangerous guns on par with tank destroyers. They have much better protection. They're just all around better. Just all around. And this makes specialized tank destroyers less necessary. Also, wheeled vehicles lack protection. In order to get the same level of protection, you would have to seriously improve the suspension or the wheels themselves, or you might as well just switch to tracks at that point, because wheeled vehicles are designed to be lighter and faster, which means you're going to suffer in the armor department. And tank destroyers in the modern day rely more on mobility instead of armor anyway. In urban combat or against modern anti-tank weapons, they are more vulnerable to RPGs, IEDs, and drones. And of course, tanks. Third, air power and missiles have changed warfare. In the past, tank destroyers were needed to counter enemy armor. Today, many vehicles like attack helicopters, anti-tank guided missiles, and drones can eliminate tanks from long distances. They're not as necessary. And fourth, they have very limited use cases. Tank destroyers excel in certain terrains and strategies, but they are not universal. Countries with large open battlefields, like Ukraine, would prefer tracked MBTs, while nations with urban or mountainous terrain may favor wheeled armor instead. In fact, we saw that in countries like Afghanistan. But despite their decline, tank destroyers could still have a place in modern warfare. So, as history progresses and as technology gets better, we may see different forms of tank destroyers. We may see different styles of tank destroyers, different purposes for tank destroyers, and different tank destroyer designs entirely. Things we've never even thought of. For instance, we have hybrid warfare and rapid deployment. In conflicts involving fast-moving insurgents or mixed conventional and guerrilla forces, a wheeled tank destroyer can deploy much faster than MBTs. This gives them an advantage in quick response, which can make the difference between winning or losing a war, as we've seen in the past and in history. Or expeditionary forces. Like I just said, nations that rely on quick response units to make quick strikes, tank destroyers provide firepower without the logistical strain of heavy armor, because they're much more flexible. And cost effectiveness. Not every country can afford a full fleet of expensive MBTs, because I don't think, if you're watching this video, you're probably a tank nerd, which means you've probably looked up the price of certain tanks or seen it mentioned. Main battle tanks are really flippin' expensive. Like, they get up to, some of the cheaper main battle tanks are like 2.5 million apiece. The Abrams, depending on the model, is around $5 to $11 million per unit. That racks up pretty quickly. Tank destroyers can provide a much cheaper alternative while still packing heavy firepower that can eliminate other MBTs. That's one of the historical advantages of the tank destroyer. Because they were much cheaper and much more simply built, most of the time, they were usually less expensive. Now we do have exceptions like the Jagd Tiger, the Ferdinand, and even the Jagd Panther to a certain extent. But the Jagd Panther was still much cheaper and easier to produce than your average Panther. So well. Countries like Italy, Japan, and China clearly see the value in modern tank destroyers. The question is, will other nations follow, or will MBTs remain dominant? While tank destroyers aren't as common as they once were, their role in modern warfare isn't entirely obsolete. The battlefield is constantly changing. Perhaps in the near future, we'll see a resurgence of the tank destroyer concept, evolved and ready for 21st century combat.